It had begun as something almost too perfect to be real. A whirlwind romance between two people who, by all appearances, had found something extraordinarily rare in each other. Ryan and Mia's story unfolded with an almost storybook-like quality, the kind of chance encounter and deep connection that many search for but few ever find. Ryan, a 31-year-old data analyst, was the sort of man who had always prioritized his career and the responsibilities that came with it. He was meticulous, organized, and driven, qualities that had served him well in his profession, where attention to detail was paramount. But in matters of love, Ryan had always felt somewhat lost. Love, to him, was an elusive thing, more like a figment of fantasy than something real and attainable. It was something he saw in films or read about in novels, but it seemed distant and intangible in his own life. He had dated a few people over the years, but nothing had ever felt right. There was always a missing piece, an empty space where true connection should have been. He had started to believe that perhaps he was simply one of those people for whom love was not meant to happen. Then Mia appeared. Mia seemed to burst into Ryan's life with an energy and warmth that immediately shattered the monotony of his routine existence. She was strikingly beautiful, with her long, chestnut hair that cascaded down her back and eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief and depth. But it wasn't just her looks that drew Ryan to her. It was her intelligence, her wit, and the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence. Mia had a magnetic personality, effortlessly drawing people into her orbit, and Ryan was no exception. They had met by chance at a mutual friends gathering, a casual barbecue in the backyard of a house neither of them particularly wanted to be at. Ryan had been reluctant to attend, tired after a long week of work, and uninterested in making small talk with people he barely knew. Mia, on the other hand, had shown up as a favor to a friend, not expecting much from the evening. But when their eyes met across the patio, something shifted for both of them. It was as if, in that moment, the rest of the world faded into the background. They found themselves drawn together, and within minutes of talking, they felt an almost instant connection, a chemistry that was undeniable. Ryan was captivated by Mia's sense of humor, the way she could turn even the most mundane topics into something engaging and lively. They shared a mutual love for adventure and exploration, something that became evident as they exchanged stories about past travels and dreams of future destinations. Over the next few weeks, their relationship deepened at a pace that surprised them both. They went on spontaneous trips, explored hidden hiking trails, and spent long nights talking about everything from their childhoods to their hopes for the future. There was an easiness between them that made it feel as though they had known each other for years, even though they had only just met. It wasn't long before Ryan realized he was falling for Mia, harder and faster than he had ever fallen for anyone before. She seemed to fill the gaps in his life that he hadn't even realized were there. Her presence brought a warmth and brightness that had been missing for so long. It was a feeling of completeness that he had never experienced, and it was intoxicating. For the first time in his life, love felt real, tangible, and within reach. And so, it didn't take long before Ryan knew that Mia was the one. After just 6 months of dating, he found himself standing on a mountaintop, the wind whipping around them, as he knelt down and asked her to marry him. Mia's acceptance had come with that same radiant smile that had first captivated him, her eyes glowing with happiness. The engagement was a whirlwind, and within months, they were standing together at the altar, surrounded by their closest friends and family, exchanging vows and promises of a lifetime spent together. The wedding was modest but beautiful, an intimate affair that felt just right for them. Everything about the day had been perfect. The ceremony, the reception, the laughter shared among loved ones. Ryan felt as though he were living in a dream, one that he never wanted to wake from. The first few months of their marriage were everything Ryan had hoped for. They moved into a small but charming house in a quiet neighborhood. The house, though modest, was filled with potential, and Ryan often imagined the future they would build together there, maybe even starting a family someday. He loved coming home from work to find Mia in the kitchen, her soft laughter filling the air as they shared stories about their day. Their evenings were spent curled up on the couch, watching movies or talking about their plans for the future. There was a simplicity and contentment in those early days that made Ryan feel like the luckiest man in the world. But as the months passed, Ryan began to notice subtle changes in Mia. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing that could be easily pinpointed, but rather a series of small shifts that, when put together, began to create a sense of unease. Mia, who had always been so open and lively, seemed to withdraw at times. There were moments when she would grow distant, her laughter fading, her expression becoming thoughtful, even sad. Ryan noticed how her gaze would drift away, as if her mind were somewhere far from where they were. Whenever he asked her if something was wrong, she would smile and brush it off, assuring him that everything was fine. But as time went on, those assurances began to feel hollow. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that Mia was keeping something from him, something important. His love for her was as strong as ever, but alongside it, a growing sense of doubt began to take root. He tried to tell himself that every marriage had its challenges, that no relationship was perfect all the time. They had only been married for a few months after all, and were still learning how to navigate the complexities of living together and building a future. But the nagging feeling that something was wrong refused to leave him. It was on a rainy afternoon that everything changed. Ryan had come home from work earlier than usual, excited to surprise Mia with flowers and a quiet evening together. The rain had cast a gray pall over the house as he stepped inside, the usual warmth absent. The house was silent, eerily so, and a strange sense of foreboding settled over him. He called out for Mia, but there was no answer. Assuming she was out running errands, Ryan made his way upstairs to their bedroom, where he planned to leave the flowers as a surprise. When he entered the room, his eyes were immediately drawn to Mia's laptop, lying open on the bed. It was an unusual sight. Mia had always been very protective of her personal devices, never leaving them unlocked or unattended. Ryan felt a wave of curiosity wash over him, but also something darker, a sense of trepidation. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure whether he should invade her privacy. But the unease he had been feeling for weeks now pushed him forward. He sat down on the bed and glanced at the screen. What he saw there made his heart stop. An email thread was open, a conversation between Mia and someone he didn't recognize. A close friend, it seemed, but one that Ryan had never met. The messages were long and personal, filled with words that cut deep into Ryan's soul. In those emails, Mia had revealed a part of herself that Ryan had never known existed. She had confided in her friend about her past, about a secret she had kept from Ryan for as long as they had been together. Mia had been born male and had transitioned years before she ever met Ryan. The emails detailed her fears about Ryan discovering the truth, how she had always intended to tell him but had never found the right moment. Her words spoke of the love she had for him, but also of the overwhelming fear that he might not accept her if he knew the truth. Ryan sat frozen in disbelief, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him like a tidal wave. How could this be? How could Mia have kept something so fundamental from him? In that moment, it felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him, leaving him adrift in a sea of confusion and anger. He had always prided himself on being open-minded and accepting of others, but this was different. This was personal. This was his wife, the woman he had vowed to spend the rest of his life with, and now he felt as though their entire marriage had been built on a lie. In the days that followed, Ryan's emotions were a whirlwind. He couldn't bring himself to face Mia, couldn't bear the thought of confronting her about what he had discovered. He spent nights away from their home, staying with a friend, drowning his sorrows in sleepless nights and too much alcohol. The revelation had shattered the foundation of everything he thought he knew about their relationship. Had their love been real, or had Mia only been using him to hide her secret? Mia, left alone in their home, was devastated. She had always known there was a risk in keeping her past from Ryan, but she had hoped, in her heart of hearts, that they would be able to navigate it together when the time came. She had never imagined it would end like this. Her love for Ryan was real, but now it seemed as though that love had been tainted, twisted into something unrecognizable by the secrets she had kept. She tried reaching out to him, sending him messages, hoping they could talk and work through the pain together, but Ryan remained distant, his silence speaking volumes. Mia loved Ryan deeply, But now it seemed as though that love had been twisted into something unrecognizable. She tried reaching out to him, calling and texting in the hopes that they could talk things through. But each time, her messages went unanswered. She knew Ryan needed time, but she feared he might never come back. It was a week later when Ryan finally returned home. He was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from days of drinking and sleepless nights. He had spent the past few days wrestling with his emotions, trying to make sense of everything. But as he walked through the front door, he realized that there were no easy answers. Mia was sitting at the kitchen table when he entered, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Ryan stood in the doorway, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to scream, to shout, to make her understand the depth of his pain. But all he could do was stare at her, the woman he had once loved so completely, and feel the weight of the betrayal between them. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ryan said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way, Mia." Her heart shattered at his words. But she knew that he had every right to feel the way he did. She had lied to him, kept a part of herself hidden for fear of losing him. But in the end, her silence had caused the very thing she had been trying to avoid. "Please," Mia begged, her voice trembling. "Please, just give me a chance to make this right. I love you, Ryan. I've always loved you." Ryan's face hardened. "I don't even know who you are anymore." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Mia alone once again. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between Ryan and Mia only grew. Ryan had moved out of their home, refusing to speak to Mia or respond to her messages. He was consumed by his anger and hurt, unable to see a way forward from the betrayal he had experienced. Mia, on the other hand, was devastated by the loss of her marriage. She had always known that telling Ryan about her past would be difficult, but she had never imagined it would end like this. She had loved him with all her heart, but now that love seemed poisoned by the lies and secrets that had come to light. It was late one night when Ryan finally returned, but he was heavily drunk, his movements unsteady as he stumbled into the house. A heated argument erupted between them almost immediately. In the heat of the moment, as their voices escalated and the argument reached a fever pitch, Ryan lost control. His hands, trembling with rage, reached for Mia, grabbing her in a moment of blind fury. He didn't mean to hurt her, didn't mean for things to go as far as they did. But before he knew it, Mia was on the floor, her body motionless. The room fell into an eerie silence. The only sound was Ryan's ragged breathing as he stood over her, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He knelt beside Mia, shaking her, calling out her name. But she didn't respond. Panic set in as he realized what he had done. "Oh God," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have I done?" In a state of shock, Ryan stumbled out of the house, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, guilt, and disbelief. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He hadn't meant to hurt her. He ran, fleeing from the scene, hoping that somehow he could escape the reality of what he had done. Maya's body was discovered later that evening after a concerned neighbor heard the commotion and called the police. The investigators arrived at the scene, finding Mia lifeless on the floor of the couple's home. There were signs of a struggle, but no immediate clues as to who was responsible. Ryan was nowhere to be found. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Ryan was the prime suspect. The police discovered the texts on Mia's phone, revealing the secrets she had kept from her husband. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. The heated argument, Ryan's sudden disappearance, and the tragic outcome. For days, Ryan was on the run, hiding from the authorities as he grappled with the enormity of what he had done. But the guilt was too much to bear. He knew he couldn't run forever. Eventually, Ryan turned himself in, walking into a police station with his head hung low, ready to face the consequences of his actions. The trial was a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the country. The story of a husband discovering his wife's transgender identity and the resulting tragedy captivated the public's imagination. Both Ryan and Mia's families were thrust into the spotlight, their private pain laid bare for the world to see. Ryan's defense team argued that he had acted in the heat of the moment, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't control. They painted a picture of a man who had been deceived, whose world had been turned upside down by a secret that shattered the foundation of his marriage. But the prosecution argued that Ryan's actions were inexcusable, that no amount of emotional turmoil could justify the taking of another person's life. They presented evidence of the physical altercation, highlighting the fact that Ryan had left Mia to die, fleeing the scene rather than seeking help. The trial was long and grueling, with both sides presenting emotional testimony. Ryan's family spoke of the loving, kind man they had known, struggling to reconcile that image with the man who had killed his wife. Mia's family, devastated by her death, spoke of the pain and loss they felt, their daughter's life cut tragically short by a man who had claimed to love her. In the end, Ryan was found guilty of manslaughter, the jury convinced that while he hadn't intended to kill Mia, his actions had been reckless and violent. He was sentenced to several years in prison, a punishment that felt both too little and too much for a man who had acted out of a momentary lapse in control. The aftermath of the trial left both families shattered. Ryan's family struggled to come to terms with what he had done, while Mia's family was consumed by grief. They had lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, and no amount of justice could ever bring her back. For Ryan, the cost of his actions was immeasurable. He lost his wife, his freedom, and the life he had envisioned for himself. But more than that, he lost a part of himself. The man he had once been replaced by the man who had taken another person's life in a moment of blind fury. For Mia, the consequences had been immeasurable. She had lived authentically, embracing her identity in the face of adversity, striving to carve out a life filled with love and understanding. Yet, in the end, it was the very love she had for Ryan, the desperation to keep him close, that ultimately sealed her tragic fate. After everything came crashing down, both their families were left shattered, questioning not only the circumstances of Mia's death, but also the heartbreaking reality of what might have been if the truth had emerged earlier. Mia and Ryan's tale transformed into a poignant reminder for those who had known them. It underscored the destructive nature of hidden truths, the necessity of transparency in relationships, and the damaging force that unchecked anger could unleash. While the public eventually moved on, captivated by new stories and scandals, those who had lived through the tragedy would forever carry the weight of it in their hearts. For Ryan, now serving his sentence for manslaughter, the confines of his prison cell became a space for painful reflection. His once promising future had been irrevocably altered in a flash of reckless rage. In his quiet moments behind bars, Ryan began to reckon with the enormity of his actions. No longer able to turn away from his guilt, he signed up for therapy sessions, hoping to make sense of the emotions that had overtaken him in the moments leading to Mia's death. Over time, he confronted parts of himself he had long ignored. The insecurities, the fear of rejection, and the deeply ingrained ideas of masculinity that had clouded his judgment when he discovered Mia's past. In therapy, Ryan finally opened up about the love he still harbored for Mia, despite everything. He spoke about the hole her loss had left in him, though he knew deep down that no amount of words could undo what had happened. Meanwhile, Mia's family, irreparably broken by the loss of their daughter, found a way to channel their grief into something that might keep her memory alive. They launched an organization in her honor, one dedicated to helping LGBTQ+ youth and educating communities on issues of identity, acceptance, and tolerance. Through Mia's story, they hoped others might learn to embrace honesty and understanding, sparing future individuals and families from the heartache that had so painfully marked their lives. Ryan's family, too, grappled with their own anguish. Visiting him in prison became a ritual, but the warmth that once characterized their interactions was now replaced by a heavy sense of disappointment and confusion. They struggled to reconcile the son they had raised with the man who had taken Mia's life in a moment of senseless rage. Though they stood by him, hoping for some kind of redemption when he would eventually be released, they were also burdened with the question of how things had spiraled so far out of control. As time passed, the sensational media coverage surrounding the case gradually faded. However, the lessons left behind by Mia and Ryan's relationship lingered like a shadow over those who had been touched by it. Their short-lived union became a grim cautionary tale, an example of the dangers that secrets could pose, no matter how well-intentioned they may have been. Commentators and experts who studied the case emphasized the importance of communication in relationships. They spoke about the fragility of human connections, particularly when fear and shame gave rise to dishonesty, urging for environments where people could live openly and truthfully, free from judgment or danger. For Ryan, his days in prison continued in an agonizingly slow routine. He often found himself trapped in the memory of that pivotal night, replaying the argument in his mind, wondering how he could have acted so irrationally, so violently. In the aftermath of Mia's death, Ryan found himself spiraling into a chasm of despair that felt insurmountable. He had never anticipated the depth of his actions or the irreversible consequences they would bring. The walls of his confinement felt more suffocating with each passing day, and as he wrestled with guilt and regret, it became increasingly difficult for him to see a path forward. Ryan's thoughts were consumed by haunting memories. As weeks turned into months, Ryan became a shell of his former self. He isolated himself from other inmates, avoiding their attempts at conversation and support. Instead, he sat in silence, grappling with a darkness that felt more and more like a shroud. The pressure of his guilt morphed into an unbearable weight, crushing him under the realization that Maya would never return, and that his actions had stolen her future. In the quiet solitude of his cell, the haunting whispers of his conscience grew louder. Ryan struggled to cope with the reality that he had not only ended Mia's life, but had also forfeited his own happiness, his own future. He sought help through counseling sessions, but each time he sat across from a therapist. The words felt hollow. He could not articulate the depth of his pain, nor could he find the solace he desperately sought. One fateful evening, after a particularly tumultuous day filled with memories of Mia and the futility of his situation, Ryan made a decision that would seal his fate. Overwhelmed by despair, he could no longer envision a world without her, without their love, their dreams, and the future they had envisioned together. In the depths of his anguish, he chose to escape the unbearable pain. In the stillness of his cell, he fashioned a noose, his heart racing with fear and sadness. As he hung there, the weight of his grief lifted momentarily, replaced by an eerie calm. Ryan's last thoughts drifted to Mia, the love they had shared, and the life they could have built if only he had been able to accept her truth. The news of Ryan's death sent shockwaves through both families. Mia's family felt a complex mix of relief and sorrow, grappling with the notion that the man responsible for their daughter's death had taken his own life. Ryan's family was devastated, torn between grief for their son and the anguish of knowing what he had done. As the dust settled on the tragic events, both families were left to confront the wreckage of their lives. Mia's family continued their work in her honor, advocating for understanding and acceptance in hopes that no one else would suffer as they had. Meanwhile, Ryan's family sought to find meaning in their loss, coming to terms with the haunting questions that would forever linger in their hearts. Their story, marked by love, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy, served as a sobering reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of uncommunicated truths. As the years went by, the echoes of Mia and Ryan's story faded from public view, but for those left behind, the pain of their decisions remained a poignant wound that would never fully heal.